Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's Ukrainian talk show on Pod TV. My name is Sasha Star, and we have a very special guest today. Is Professor Jonathan Lockwood. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Sasha. Glad to be here.
Yeah, I would like to ask you a question. In the last couple of days, I've seen a new narrative about from very, very trustful sources that change in the US and Western position on the war on Ukraine. The narrative is like the uh, what was perceived recently, the victory for Ukrainians would be to gain control of the 1991 border. Is at the circumstances is unrealistic and unachievable. On the other hand, it's not a narrative of Ukraine at all. It's just a narrative of the Western and U.S. oriented sources. Now, from the Western point of view, and US included, all the goals of this war were achieved. Russia is so much weakened in every respect, from militaristic point of view, financial, technological, just name it. And besides, they lost 300,000 or so young people. So that a dreadful result of this aggression, and it will take Russia 10 years or more to get out of this malaise where it is now. So therefore, if the war could be stopped right now or in a very near future, this is very, very good and very positive result for the West and United States. It possibly a positive result for Russia as well, because the continuation of war will make Russia even weaker as every day, even every hour. It's still losing almost 1,000 people every day. So there is a stalemate of sort of. I mean, some people disagree and they believe that with a certain access to newer weapons or so on, the stalemate could be fought. And possibly so, but to be realistic, that's where the West and United States are, and perhaps Russia as well, that's where we're leaning. The big question is what Ukrainians think about it. So, Jonathan, the floor is yours. What do you think about all these developments?
Well, I think that, as I've pointed out before, the key operational development, which will bring realistic victory fastest to Ukraine, is a severance of the link between Russia and Crimea. And as we have noticed, that the Ukrainians have been successful in driving back the Russian Black Sea Fleet and opening up their lanes. And it's basically for a nation that has essentially no navy, they have been carrying out a very effective sea denial strategy to the Russians, to the Russian Black Sea Fleet. So that is a significant and often overlooked operational victory for the Ukraine. Also, we are also noticing that collectively, the various member nations of NATO are recognizing their own best self-interest in aiding Ukraine and providing it with the weapons it needs from whatever they can provide. And so Ukraine has support from various sources, and they are coming in separately, not in a very coordinated fashion, but they are coming in. And it is, some reports have noticed that it is starting to change the qualitative balance of power on the operational fronts. The Russians are suffering more air losses and even more ground losses, and that tactically the Ukrainians are gaining a more and more significant advantage as the Russians keep trying to push an offensive against Ukraine and suffering nothing but heavy losses. So the balance is shifting qualitatively in Ukraine's favor. It is not shifting in Russia's favor. So what I'm seeing is the Western leadership, particularly U.S. leadership, is, in my opinion, wisely deciding not to push for a major offensive on the part of Ukraine, conserve Ukraine's strength, reinforce it with better qualitative weapons, and so forth, and allow the Ukrainians enough freedom of action to determine when they think they should throw the knockout punch.
Hmm.
Give the Ukrainians the initiative. The Ukrainians have demonstrated time and time again that they can exceed the expectations of their allies and do things that we do not expect them to be able to do. I mean, they have been doing this continually ever since the start of the war and defying the expectations of the Russians and the U.S. So this is really rather amusing in one sense because, yeah, you notice that the narrative is, oh, we're going on defense. We're going on defense. It kind of reminds me of Muhammad Ali, the boxer, where he would do his rope-a-dope and lean up against the ropes and let his opponents just whale away at him. And then some time later on, at a moment of his choosing, Muhammad would come off the ropes and just knock the living crap out of whoever opponent was facing him. So that's my expectations of the Ukrainians. They are, in one sense, they are publicly playing possum. They are playing defense, but they are tactically gaining more and more of an advantage vis-a-vis the Russians. And I fully expect within the next 2 to 3 months that the Ukrainians will inflict a surprise operational defeat, whether it be in the Black Sea Fleet in terms of totally annihilating the remainder of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, or just breaking that link between Russia and Crimea and effectively isolating the Russian occupation forces. Once that occurs, then the opportunity arises for Ukraine to commit its reserves that it has not yet committed to this point. They could commit those forces to clearing out the Crimea and forcing the surrender of what would be the then isolated Russian occupation forces. And the Institute for the Study of War has recognized this possibility. I'm not the only one saying this. The Institute for the Study, that they recognize a realistic possibility that if the Ukrainians succeed in severing the link between Russia and Crimea and forcing the surrender of those Russian occupation forces, that would be a major strategic victory. Similar, if we use the analogy of the American Civil War, it would be similar to the Union victory at Vicksburg, where they succeeded in severing the link between the western and eastern halves of the Confederacy. Once that was achieved, it was the beginning of the end for the Confederacy.
Very well. Actually, the analysis of Institute of Study of War, one of their article was headed by statement, a stalemate? What stalemate? That's exactly what he said. There's no such thing as stalemate. It's although they admitted one interesting thing is that the defensive capacities of both armies are such elevated level that any attack is almost impossible because the attackers usually they have losses of 3-1 compared to defensemen. Now it's going to be maybe 6-1, maybe even 8-1. It's so dreadful.
Ukraine is recognizing this, and they're simply reinforcing their defense and the quality of their defense, and it is showing up in the casualties they inflict on the Russians, and it's just amazing. And I believe that the Western analysts and Western leadership are recognizing this. NATO is recognizing this. They are pouring in the support to Ukraine to bolster their defense and keep the Russians from ever really achieving any hope for a significant operational or strategic victory. And there's been several, as well as Winston Churchill first pointed out, the Russians respect only force. They respect strength. They despise nothing more. They despise nothing more than weakness. They especially despise weakness, especially military weakness. And Ukraine is displaying anything but weakness.
Absolutely.
So they are frustrating the Russian aims, and it is to the Western advantage to not just take this for granted, but to follow up on this to ensure that Russia will be compelled to accept a ceasefire on Ukrainian terms. In other words, pull out of Ukraine, force them to retreat, and force them to do this. It's not something that they should be. If the Russians can lie about it all they want and say, "Oh, we've achieved our objectives," okay, you've achieved your objectives. Now get the hell out of here.
With your objections. I do remember it's more than 200 years ago when Napoleon invaded Russia, and he actually Moscow. And he was waiting any time capitulation of Russian Tsar Alexander I, and it never happened.
No. They did not. They did not bother to surrender. And Napoleon was completely baffled. And then the Russians apparently set fire to Moscow, and then Napoleon was compelled to retreat,
and lost almost all.
He lost almost all his army because as he was compelled to retreat, all the Russians had to do was just keep pursuing him, not engage, but pursue him, keep the pressure on him, and keep harassing his supply lines, harassing him with the Cossacks and everybody else. And the Napoleon's army simply dissolved, froze to death.
Yeah, that's a very interesting analogy. What's today Russia is in Ukraine. Reminds me somewhat Napoleon's army in Moscow 200 years ago or so. What's happened is that Russia now makes all kind of peace proposals. Putin is ready for peace. So there is a situation now when there is no war and no peace. No war because he cannot progress any farther because of the Russian, Ukrainian fortifications and ability to defend their positions. And there is no peace. Nobody talks to him about peace. There is still Zelensky's law about no negotiations with Russia while Putin is in power. And they didn't cancel that. It's still enforced. It's still the law of the land in Ukraine. So how you can arrange a peace when nobody talks to you about the peace? You can talk to NATO, you can talk to the United States, and even whom you talk to U.S. Biden, who has a few more months left, or all these new Republicans. I saw yesterday debates. There were town hall. First one was for an hour was DeSantis, and second hour was Nikki Haley. They are absolutely on opposite sides regarding help to Ukraine. DeSantis says that there is, he didn't go as far as to say there will be no single dollar to help Ukraine. He was almost there, but he stopped right by saying he was very evasive, and he was talking about.
He was trying to distance himself enough from Mr. Trump so as to provide Republicans an alternative, but he has not yet laid out a coherent plan. None of the Republicans have laid out a coherent strategic view. Not mainly because if you try to lay out a coherent strategic view for the American population, you run the risk of putting your audience to sleep. Because
Nikki Haley did quite well in that respect
Yeah,
yesterday.
given that, she managed to come across the best as far as communicating a solid message.
Yes. I think she presented yesterday a few ideas for average American person that I think Biden's administration lacks even now. Basically, she explained in very simple terms, we don't want American soldiers to sacrifice their lives in whether it's Asia or Europe or anywhere else. We don't want that. But look, if Russia is successful in Ukraine and will definitely move on Baltic states and Poland, never mind farther than that, we already have to be at war, according to Article 5 of NATO, and then we will have to face and fight Russians, and then we will have to sacrifice lives of our servicemen.
Right.
This is why so much better now to exhaust Russia one way or another, maybe even defeat if possible. So this way you will save lives of.
As a matter of fact, as a further variant on that, if we succeed in defeating Russia now and preventing it from getting it to withdraw from Ukraine, Ukraine becomes the central eastern bulwark once it's able to join NATO. But the U.S. can, although it seems paradoxical or contradictory, that by stationing American troops in certain key positions of our eastern allies in Finland, stationing American troops in Finland in a certain capacity, as well as in even Ukraine. But the idea is for these American forces would not be there so much to repel a Russian invasion. They would certainly assist in defense, but they would serve as one past leader put it, the necessary trigger. It would provide a guarantee. Essentially, it would be saying to Russia, attack any one of these eastern members of NATO that have American forces stationed in them, and you have attacked the United States, and you are at war with the United States. And that it would be the best intermediate to long-term guarantee of stability and security, along with what I have recommended earlier in upgrading the U.S. Space Force to include a space fleet, even though it's an indirect approach, it's an asymmetrical approach. But it would be one where if we include in that Space Force a space fleet that is armed with laser weapons, capable of shooting down ballistic missiles in their boost phase before they can reach a point where they're dangerous, then we will have effectively neutralized the one thing that makes Russia a great power in its own perception. We will have neutralized their nuclear ballistic missile force.
Jonathan, you see, here's the ability to build a U.S. Space Force and have this program available. I mean, technically, it's very possible to implement. There is nothing.
Oh, yes. It's very possible. Yeah.
It's very possible. Remember when Ronald Reagan announced its so-called Star War?
And I remember reading, just how panicked the Russians, the Soviets, they were absolutely panicked because, as a matter of fact, as Oleg Gordievsky, a KGB defector, said in a book published with Christopher Andrew, KGB, the Inside Story, and he talked about in the latter part of the book how a KGB report on the Star Wars system, the Star Wars initiative, had been sent to Gorbachev in April 1985. And their estimate was that the SDI would eventually be able to block 90% of Soviet missiles in a first strike, and there was no way that the Soviet Union could keep up with this capability. This is what motivated Gorbachev to exert every effort that he could to try to persuade President Reagan to give up SDI. He even was prepared to, massively disarm anything to stop SDI. And President Reagan, very wisely, said, absolutely not. He had leverage.
So this is exactly an example of very successful public relation campaign on Ronald Reagan and his team, that they were so far away from implementing that SDI project, and yet Russians were so fearful of that they were ready for anything just to.
They have, Sasha, the Russians had shown that they have been scared of the U.S. Patriot system. Back in January 1985, for example, my former brigade commander, when I was a Brigade S2 for 10th ADA Brigade, he asked me, he says, Jonathan, you read those Russian military journals. Ask me see if the Russians are saying anything about Patriot. And so I looked at the January 85 issue of Vestnik Protovovzdushnoi Obrony, Herald of Anti-Aircraft Defense, and saw an article on U.S. medium to high altitude air defense systems. And the last third of that article dealt with Patriot. And I'm looking at it, and I saw the Russian acronym PRO, Protovoroketnoi Obrony. The author was describing Patriot as an ABM system, an anti-ballistic missile system designed to be used for the strategic defense of the United States. The Russians were seeing Patriot as the leading edge of SDI. That's in effect is what they were doing. They were showing genuine fear of the ABM potential of U.S. ballistic missile defense systems, particularly Patriot. And they were reading this ABM capability of Patriot 2 years before Patriot actually displayed an ABM capability in public. Yeah, it were actually publicly tested Patriot against a U.S. Lance missile and successfully intercepted it, thereby demonstrating that, yes, Patriot does have an ABM capability. But how did they figure it out? Well, Raytheon had developed this Safeguard anti-ballistic missile system, had phased array radar. They also were the ones who developed Patriot with phased array radar. Therefore, it was easy for the Russians to figure out, okay, Patriot's got an ABM capability. That's how they figured it out. But they exaggerated that capability. In their minds, it grew to their fear of the potential of American technology was such that they were looking for every indication that the U.S. was about to implement SDI on a full scale.
John, you remember the episode when it was a decision to have Patriot missiles staged in Poland?
Yes.
And Russia was against it. Almost they would go to war because they were believing that Patriots in Poland, they would intercept intercontinental ballistic missiles from Russia. And America explained to them that they have completely different trajectory. If this intercontinental filed from somewhere in Siberia, they would go over the North Ocean to over Canada to United States, and Poland has nothing to do with interception of those missiles. And Russians still wouldn't budge.
Yeah, they wouldn't believe it. Well, what the Russians also probably believe that the deployment of Patriot systems in Poland would provide an effective anti-ballistic missile defense against any Russian attempts to attack Poland or NATO with nuclear weapons. Remember that the Soviets did have war plans for attacking NATO. They had them. We discovered this in 1990 when the West Germans went into the East German bases and discovered the war plans, in which the Warsaw Pact was planning to initiate nuclear use as early as the first day of the war, with up to 300 nuclear strikes against NATO targets. And it was kind of a small sigh of relief in the West at that point. Oh, we dodged a bullet there. No, you haven't. What you've done is it reveals the willingness of Russia to use nuclear weapons against NATO if it comes to a genuine war with NATO. Now, it's the Russians have been they really have been overplaying their hand as far as their nuclear capability goes. So eventually your threats lose their credibility. So right now it's a very interesting little game. The West is wisely, in my opinion, declaring that we are going on defense. We are not going for a liberation or rollback strategy, if you will. Ukraine is not going to be we're not going to physically drive you out. Of course, the Ukrainians may have their own ideas about that. It doesn't mean that the Ukrainians can't throw a decisive counterpunch at the operational level to cripple Russia's ability to win the war even further. And they have the opportunities. It's a matter of patience. And we have to concede the fact that we do not know everything that is going on behind the scenes. We can't. It's impossible.
Okay. Now, it's very interesting what you just mentioned, that Russia had a very detailed, or the Soviet Union rather, very detailed plans to attack NATO, which is a much more powerful entity than Ukraine. And yet they don't have any realistic plan how to win the war in Ukraine.
They never thought they would have to confront that possibility, apparently. They completely misread the situation. They thought, as one observer, they were anticipating that the Ukrainians would switch sides, that the government would collapse, that it would be essentially a cakewalk, that they never anticipated determined resistance by the Ukrainians. They never anticipated that NATO would not only be galvanized and start providing aid to Ukraine, but that additional members who were formerly neutral, Finland and Sweden, would sign and say, "We're joining NATO." And so now it's just it has been an absolute strategic disaster for Russia.
You know who is becoming a very strong ally of Ukraine with very, very substantial help on its way? It's Norway. Norway has over $1 trillion sovereign fund, and they are ready to move decisively to help Ukraine with. Actually, they are producing a lot of ammunition and weapons. And
Yeah, what's really nice is that technically, Norway does have in the north a very narrow frontier in common with Russia.
Yes, they do, around Murmansk.
Yeah, around Murmansk, and as a matter of fact, that's why the Germans in World War II kept substantial forces in Norway, because there were possibilities for the Germans to exert pressure against Murmansk, and basically the idea would be hopefully what the Germans wanted to do was to disrupt the Lend-Lease supply line between Russia and the United States in the West. But in any case, Norway is another wonderful strategic asset for Ukraine, and all of this is working in Ukraine's favor, which is why, despite the fact that Ukraine is at least publicly on the defensive, their capability, both qualitatively and quantitatively, for mounting a really effective counteroffensive, not across the entire front, but striking a selective blow at a key weakness of the Russians' defense. And
Right.
I'm still waiting patiently for that.
Mm. So Ukraine is playing right now, I think, the right strategy of containing Russian forces, keeping the defensive capabilities, and they are doing that very well, and causing Russia to lose almost 1,000. Actually, it was all except the last 3 days, maybe because of the New Year, they were losing well over 1,000 people a day, Russians. Now it's almost 1,000, 790, 850, something slightly less. So maybe Russians also learned something from their attacks and daily losses. So maybe they're trying to save a few more people here and there. So we are witnessing that you can talk as much as you want about the peace around. Without Ukraine, there will be no peace. So there will be a situation where there is, like in Napoleon's time, no war and no peace. So that's exhausting the army. So Russian also have great difficulties. They have to supply all these forces. It involves logistics. It involves
and logistics has never been the Russian strong point.
Not at all, not at all. And especially when sooner or later, I believe that the Crimean Bridge will be completely ruined and will be impossible to use. So then their supply lines will be severed only to those which are based in Lugansk and Donetsk region. There will no more any supplies from Crimea. So therefore, there might be even a case when Ukraine doesn't have to force invasion of Crimea because it's not needed.
They may achieve victory just simply through isolation. The Russian forces simply give up. And,
so the situation is looking as there was so much despair and so much negativities about the Ukraine situation. It's not that bad at all. And I think they're getting more and more determined to turn this war in their favor. And I think they will be able to do it, and not in too distant future.
One of the things that we have to remember, Sasha, is that most of the Western military analysts, and I put that in quotes because I tend to be somewhat sarcastic about these sorts of things. Most of these analysts are people who have never served in the military, never studied history to any significant degree, and yet they're looking for the latest narrative to sort of chime and say, "Oh, everything is hopeless," and so forth and so on, because they want headlines. They aren't concerned about trying to be as accurate or as informative as possible. They are simply going what seems to get them headlines at the moment.
Exactly.
And so in that case, I take that with a great deal of cynicism and skepticism. And yet, and my wife Kathleen refers to me as a relentless optimist. Well, I I often have some justification for that relentless optimism because I look at this I look at the strategy and tactics in view of historical precedent, in view of the context of the political situation overall, and I believe that contrary to the narrative which is going on in the West right now, this stalemate is not a prelude to a negotiated peace on Russia's terms. Rather, it is a period of consolidation and reinforcement for Ukraine, where they are gaining strength, they are gaining advantages, both tactically as well as operationally. And I predict that there is going to be an activity within the next 2 to 3 months where Ukraine will inflict a decisive operational blow against Russian forces,
Yeah.
which will change the character of the war. Go ahead.
All the Russians are doing now, it's a barbaric missiles and air avia attacks against Ukrainian cities, Ukrainian civilians, and they are sort of their message is that okay, we cannot win the war, but we will make so much damage to you and will scare you to death, so you will have to accept the peace anyway. So Ukrainians are very smart to have their own attacks against Russian cities like Belgorod, for example, and they are very successful not only against Black Sea Russian fleet, but also against certain targets like airports where they have Russian bombers stationed, and there are numerous examples of very successful attacks. At the same time, Ukrainians are trying to preserve their weapons and missiles and so on. Even artillery attack, they are very measured and much less intensive as it was even a few weeks ago. So they're preparing for a long war, and it's going to be eventually it will be disaster for Russia and Russian army, and that's what I think the goal of the Ukraine and the West and the United States is about the same, in my opinion.
I agree.
Yeah. Okay, Jonathan, I would like to thank you very much for today's program, and we would like you to have a very good weekend. So to our listeners, thank you very much, everybody, and we'll see you same place, same time on Tuesday. Bye-bye, everybody.